Hello, listeners, and welcome to another episode of Cognitive Dissidence. As usual, I'm your host. I'm Jacob Shapiro. I'm a partner and the director of geopolitical analysis at Cognitive Investments. Joining me on the podcast today is Carolyn Eaton Tracey. She is a writer who writes about the environment, migration, arts in the U.S. Southwest, Mexico, and their borderlands. She has a PhD in geography from the University of California, Berkeley, and she's currently working on a book called Salt Lakes. I discovered Caroline because she wrote an amazing article that's in the New York Review of Books. We will put a link to that article in the show notes called Stopping the Old Rio Grande. Before I lived in New Orleans, I lived in Austin, Texas, off and on for almost a decade, and Texas is always sort of in the back of my mind, and it was a really poignant and beautiful piece about the Rio Grande River, about environmentalism in Texas, about the relationship between border towns in Texas and Mexico. I just can't recommend the article enough. And Caroline was happy enough to come on the podcast to talk a little bit about the article, give us some of her perception from being on the ground in these places. And as I said in the podcast itself, she had this amazing line where she talked about how we have come to think of rivers as natural boundaries that divide communities. And her writing really brings out how it's easy to forget that there's another way to see them. In her words, they're the soft tissue in the landscape that nourishes and connects everything around it. So I can't imagine a better guest and a better topic for thinking about geography and geopolitics and the relationships between all of those things. And Carolyn, I want to thank her for responding to a random email that I sent her and agreeing to come on the podcast. I'm sure that she's going to go very far. Listeners, if you want to hear more about cognitive investments, or if you want to recommend more articles or show guests to me, or you just want to chat, it's Jacob at cognitive.investments. Cheers, take care of each other. I will see you out there. Thank you so much for responding to a random email and agreeing to come on the podcast. You'd be surprised how many people, most people don't answer the emails, but I've gotten so many great guests who just take a leap of faith and spend some time with us. So thanks for coming on.
Thanks for inviting me.
This podcast is normally about geopolitics, and I've been struggling for a way to think about how to talk about what's happening at the U.S.-Mexico border without sort of devolving into, oh my God, crisis, oh my God, record numbers of migrants, blah, blah, blah. And then there was your article in the New York Review of Books, and I was like, great, somebody who's actually thinking about geography and how land affects people and people affect land, and this seems like a good way to kind of back into it. I wanted to start, though, because I think it's always good to know where people are coming from. So how did you get sort of interested in this particular corner of the world? Because there's lots of rivers and lots of borders. We've had, guests on here talk about the Colorado before. I'm in New Orleans, which is a whole river story of its own. It's funny how much of that kind of crosses over with what you're working on. But why the Rio Grande? Why has that captured your imagination?
Great question. I am originally from Colorado, so I guess maybe that's a part of the answer. The headwaters of the Rio Grande are in southern Colorado. And so then when I did my PhD, I ended up focusing on the U.S.-Mexico border and thinking about the Rio Grande as the border, I guess, is kind of, like a intersection of my personal background and that academic background.
Yeah. One of the things I was struck by and tell me if I'm reading too far into this, but it almost seemed like you were blaming some of the problems on the border to the decisions to alter the river's flow, sort of in the 1950s and afterwards. Am I taking it too far, or is that a fair characterization?
I probably don't lay that out explicitly, but I think there is probably some implication of that in what I wrote. That maybe to follow my last answer, the sort of more precise story of how I ended up writing about the Falcon Dam in particular, and that particular spot on the border is that I had been down in South Texas doing reporting about migrant death and humanitarian work there. And one of the first people I met in South Texas was from a town called Salinenio, which is one town below the Falcon Dam. And he kind of offhandedly mentioned, like, oh, yeah, when I was a kid, we could wade across, and then they built the Falcon Dam, and we couldn't do that anymore because it was channelized and it was deeper. The flow was more intense. And I was really captured by that fact that this water infrastructure had made it so that the border was something that actually divided people, whereas previously they had been able to have this relationship in kind of a quotidian way with the towns on the other side. So that, that sort of federal infrastructure as something that has a really meaningful impact in communities is a theme throughout all kinds of like environmental history and all sorts of scholarship and writing. And I had never really seen it play out in the border, except in the border wall discourse, right? That the border wall is having a similar effect. So certainly, like sort of metaphorically and philosophically, conceptually, I guess I do see them as very, very linked.
Yeah, there was a sentence in your piece that was about how we've come to think of rivers as natural boundaries that divide communities and nations rather than as sort of ecosystems that human communities live around and connect through. And I wondered if you could just talk about that idea, because I had never seen it summed up quite that way. And it's true. I mean, like, who needs a border wall when you have a Falcon Dam and a river that you can't get across and everything else? But I mean, it even makes me think that, the difference between what happens on the Mexican side of the border versus the U.S. side of the border, I wonder if things would be that different if they hadn't gone and messed with the actual landscape. Because maybe there were similarities that were there before that have nothing to do with the Protestant work ethic and, legal institutions and everything else. I don't know, take that in whatever direction you want.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that I sort of, it was in the back of my mind writing that sentence was, I think there's this sort of corrective logic that has come up in my education and probably in others, of where we've come around to the idea that the European powers drawing squares on a map was not the right way to divide up the world, but that rivers are the natural way to divide a border, right? That, like, obviously that we have a perfectly drawn line right there, so that's where the border should be, and that's much more natural as a border than a square line. But maybe a river is not meant to be a border either. Maybe a river doesn't want to be a border, right? So I think that was in the back of my mind, is that why we sort of like naturalize this idea that the river is the correct dividing line, or it makes sense as a dividing line, when actually the people that live on the rivers use it as a connective thing. And in the case of the Falcon Dam, one thing that came up a lot in my research that I still haven't fully kind of resolved for myself was the question of flooding, because when they decided to build the dams on the Rio Grande, including the Falcon Dam, one of sort of three justifications, the other, which I think really the key justification for building these dams was to provide irrigation water for farms near the mouth of the river, which was sort of at the early 20th century in the process of being kind of colonized by white settlers from the Midwest. And they needed irrigation water. And so I think for me, that seems to be clearly the sort of like biggest motivation of building these dams. But all the accounts and some of the people I interviewed also referenced, there were these floods, and some of them said like grave floods. But the accounts of people who lived there and who are from the towns like Salinenio had somewhat, they didn't bring it up in that same way, right? Like they talked about flooding as sort of a seasonal process, and that you would like plant your melon crop on the bank of the river so that it would benefit from the flooding. And it was something that people kind of worked with. And my sense is that it wasn't that people were living right up to the riverbank. Even if you go to Salinenio today, because that's a town that is still intact, because it's downstream of the dam, you have to walk a ways to get from the town to the river. So I'm agnostic on this flooding point. It seems to me that the federal government saw flooding as a much more of a threat than the people who had lived there for a long time.
This is where the story for me, I've only lived in New Orleans for a couple of years now, but there is this mentality of, rather than living with water like the Dutch do or other water-based communities do, you have to keep it out, or you have to keep it in the same space. I mean, to your point, I guess a river can be a border if it doesn't move very much. But I was doing reading about the Rio Grande to prep for this, and the Rio Grande it's not supposed to be fixed. The whole point is that it literally floods and creates ecosystems around it and creates new pathways. Like of course, there's not going to be a river there anymore. So I don't know. Like, how do you explain? Do you have an explanation for the decision to do this in the 1950s? Because sitting here, it seems completely asinine, and they must have had some. I mean, like I guess you were saying you're not done with your research yet when it comes to this. But the idea that flooding is bad. Flooding is the whole point. Flooding is why it's there.
Yeah, I mean, but I think that there's an impulse to control nature, and especially to control water that is pervasive, and especially in that era of dam building. There's a very famous case about the Rio Grande shifting called the Chamizal, which there's a park in El Paso now that was the land that it was this essentially it was an island, and the river shifted course, and then they didn't know really to which side of the border it belonged, and it was a pretty long and drawn out court case that a number of historians have written about. And then more recently, there was just in the last few months with the current kind of escalation of Texas military force at the border. Governor Abbott sent in Texas DPS, or he sent down there the Texas National Guard to clear all the brush in this island that on maps was marked as being part of Mexico. Like the way that the maps, like Google Maps or any map you looked at, marked the flow of the river, it showed that island belonging to Mexico. But then I went in a rabbit hole and looked at the treaty, and the treaty is you mark the river where the biggest channel is. So actually the maps were incorrectly showing the smaller channel as being the river, because that island hadn't existed previously, and so just, I don't know, by default that's where the flow was. So it's still a living river. I'm thinking about this all the time because I'm now researching salt lakes, and obviously salt lakes are in crisis in terms of their decline, and in Utah, and in this archives I just mentioned to you, I've been looking at, there's this rhetoric of like, we need to use all the water, we need to channelize it and put it into irrigation ditches, and that's just a very pervasive kind of ideology. But I think one thing someone told me, which I think is also true in the Rio Grande's case, is that like nature doesn't know it's not a lake anymore, so it's still acting like it's supposed to look. It's supposed to act, rather.
Yeah. The towns themselves, though, are not acting like they used to be. So I wanted to just tee you up to maybe talk about, you talk about Zapata and Guerrero quite a bit. And, you have these poignant moments of the waters receded to such an extent that they can now go back to the original towns. But I don't know that listeners will even know that there were towns on this part of the river that had to be evacuated, that were fully covered over with water, and that like now the towns are sort of there, and they're probably depressing and don't look nearly as picturesque. And you were there actually taking pictures of them. So I don't know, maybe just tell us about Zapata and Guerrero, and use them to sort of talk about all the different communities on the Rio Grande that have faced this change, and that definitely, even if the water doesn't know that it's supposed to change a certain way, the towns certainly have.
Yeah, for sure. The Falcon Dam, which is the dam I talk about most in my article, was built just downstream of a town called Zapata, Texas, and that was a town that had been founded in the 1700s by descendants of Spanish settlers, and throughout the 19th and 20th centuries had a lot of kind of cross-border relationships. And even though the people that initially settled there were Spanish descendants, there was a lot of intermarriage with local indigenous people, and so the people that lived there were sort of mixed race of Mexican and Hispanic descent, as were the other towns that sort of formed a string along the river. So on the Mexican side, there was a town called Guerrero that was kind of the sister city of Zapata. They had a bridge. They would go buy certain things from each other's side. Some of the kids would go like a few years to the English language school and a few years to the Mexican language school, the Spanish language school in Mexico, so that they could be bilingual. There were baseball teams in all the towns, so they would have leagues that kind of went along them. And they decided to build the dam there. They also looked at Salinenio, the town I just mentioned, which is just below the dam. And then the organization that oversees the treaty, the border treaty between the U.S. and Mexico, which is called the International Boundary and Water Commission, came and they sort of drew this topographical line showing where the area was going to flood, and it included Zapata, Guerrero, which were the biggest towns that were going to flood, and then a number of smaller kind of like ranching and farming communities along the river. And there was one town that is called San Ignacio that still exists because the people were told by the IBWC that they were going to be flooded, or rather that at least that their homes were going to be condemned. And they noticed that actually they were above the line, the like elevation line, and they said, we don't want to move. If we're not going to be flooded, we're not moving. And they won. I mean, I'm not exactly sure how the conflict played out, but they got to stay. They just all had to sign waivers that said, like, in the event that their town were to flood, they couldn't like sue the federal government. But that town is still there, and it's kind of amazing because there are these really historic sandstone buildings. And so you imagine that's what Zapata also looked like. And then on the Mexican side, it's kind of an interesting comparison because you had Guerrero, Mexico, but in that case, the Mexican government stepped in and said, okay, we're going to build a new model town for you. Like, we're going to build a central plaza, and we're going to build a school and a church and a community center. And all the workers from the Mexican side of the dam got to live in that town while it was under construction. And then when the dam was ready, the workers went home, and the people from Old Guerrero moved to New Guerrero. And that's where they had the kind of like the ceremony for the opening of the dam. And it was a really stark contrast for the Americans who saw what was going on, because in the U.S. side, the IBWC had claimed that they were only responsible for acquiring the land for the dam and paying out the kind of condemnation monies. They didn't feel like they were responsible for building a new town. So eventually the county lobbied the federal government to get a new town site platted, but it was really just like the highway and a little bit of a street grid and a couple of municipal buildings. So when you go to Zapata today, it feels like a very kind of car-centric town, like a very recently settled, unplanned kind of town, except in this small gridded area.
That's amazing. So remind me the name of the town that you said still exists with the historic sandstone buildings?
San Ignacio.
What is the culture and feel of that town like? I mean, I know you said that it has the sandstone buildings, but does it have that kind of, I don't know, multicultural, is multicultural the right word? Does it have that kind of feel, or has it also changed irrevocably? I
would say it feels, very sort of this very historic borderlands community that Zapata also is that way in terms of many of the people who live there are kind of have that heritage, but now Zapata has a bigger kind of snowbird community and people who've moved to live near the reservoir because it had fishing for a long time. So there's more of like a sportsman's kind of culture and retiree culture. San Ignacio, I would say, it feels very historic. It has a couple of interesting things. One is these towns along the border are very well known among birders because it's subtropical, so you get a big diversity of species. And so it has like a hostel for birders that honestly I'm tempted to go back and stay at because I think it would be kind of a cool thing. And then the other is that it has this artist named Michael Tracey, not spelled like my last name, who moved there and started buying through a foundation that he founded the historic buildings. And so now they're sort of set up for a degree of cultural tourism. I think the director of the foundation gave me a tour, and he kind of compared it to Marfa, Texas, which I would say it did not feel in any way like Marfa, Texas to me, but it sort of has that similar conceptually in terms of like an artist took an interest in the town and bought a number of the buildings.
Does the migration crisis feel present when you go to these sorts of towns, or do they feel sort of separate from everything that's going on?
I would say people in the towns are definitely talking about it, but it's not the most common crossing site. I mean, I talked to one woman who had worked as a census taker just by chance not as a formal interview or anything, but she was telling me that she, going door to door, there were definitely some places where she was like, this is definitely a safe house. And so there is migration, but there's migration everywhere in the border. And it's not like Del Rio or somewhere where the kind of local government has made it into kind of like a media crisis. I would say that on the contrary, the county government has been pretty anti-border wall. They're invested in maintaining their own way of life, and I think they see the federal government's presence as a threat to that.
The answer to this question is probably no, but have you come across any desire from the U.S. government or the Mexican government to get rid of some of these dams or return the river to its sort of natural course? Is that a discourse that is around even, or have the changes and the new ways of life are they so entrenched that sort of is not possible? I mean, I'm thinking specifically of the Colorado and all the water that is being used by all the different farmers and all the different local economies that are now dependent on pulling that water out and are sort of trapped between this, well, it's obvious what has to happen, but who's the one who's actually going to give up their water? So is there any sense of that, or is this just sort of the Rio Grande is going to die a slow, ignominious death?
Yeah, it's interesting to compare the Rio Grande and the Colorado, because I think obviously so much attention is on the Colorado right now, but the Rio Grande is also in dire straits. And I think just because of it running through New Mexico, which is a less populous and more poor state, and then Texas, which is, I would say, in general, fairly environmentally hostile, and also just sort of there's a lack of interest in the environment compared to the Colorado River Basin, right? Just on an ordinary person level. I think that discourse has not really reached the Rio Grande in the way that it has in the West, where you see the dams coming out in the Pacific Northwest, or even in the Colorado, where people are at least talking about what do we need to have a healthy ecosystem here. On the Colorado side, this past fall, I went to Mexicali, and I met with a group of local artists and researchers who have created this thing that they call the Colorado River Family Album. And they're basically collecting all the sort of stories and memories and documentation of how the watershed there used to be, because they've seen some of the conservation efforts in the Colorado are coming to fruition. Some water is getting to the Delta now. And so that's happened in their lifetimes, but more in their lifetimes, I think they've just seen that Mexicali is a city that used to be connected to this Delta ecosystem and now is not. When they were children, which they're my age, I'm 33, the river that ran through the center of town was put in a metal tube. And so they've seen this sort of disconnection from the landscape. And so that initiative, I think is very cool and very promising. And I do hope that the sort of if not anti-dam, at least the sort of interest in ecology and the watershed as an ecosystem will arrive to the Rio Grande, because I do think that's something that's lacking.
I was struck in your article about how in the 1950s, when the Falcon Dam gets constructed and inaugurated, it seemed like a source of friendship between the United States and between Mexico. I mean, you have President Eisenhower. I'm forgetting the name of the Mexican who was president at the time. I'm sure you'll supply it for me, but it looked like it looked like something that was actually building relations between the countries. I know there have been water disputes between the U.S. and Mexico and between farmers on both sides. In this part of the river, is that there, or is it actually that the Mexican and U.S. governments are still sort of on the same page here?
Yeah, I think it's sort of an interesting historical question, because on one hand, the presidents came down or came up in the Mexican president's name is Ruiz Cortines.
Yes.
In his case, he came up, they met, inaugurated the dam. They had this big party. They flew in a 30-piece orchestra from Mexico City. They flew in dance troops. It was a big celebration. But it was kind of masking some conflict over water. Another reason for the construction of the dam, in addition to what I just mentioned, which was the irrigators on the U.S. side needing water, was that also the Mexican side they were increasing, especially cotton growing on that side. And so there was also a lot of water pressure from that side. And then at the very mouth of the river is the city of Matamoros. And that city in particular had a lot of water shortages. Like the takes were that it was entitled to the Rio Grande water. There just wasn't water getting there. And so there had been kind of like, if you go to the archive, you see just telegram after telegram after telegram from the Mexican sort of functionary in Matamoros just saying like to Washington saying like, we need water here. And so there was this conflict, and the dams were supposed to help resolve this, that they were going to create the water storage necessary for all the irrigators on both sides. They obviously, as in the case of the Colorado, overestimated how much water there was going to be on a yearly basis, but that was the idea. And so I think there was a big element of optimism, but I think also something that's true is that right now, our perspective is skewed because the border has become this incredibly like politicized place and issue, and both presidential candidates are going to make it a big issue this election season. But I think in general, the borderlands are pretty like remote provincial place that probably neither Eisenhower nor Ruiz Cortines thought about a whole lot. Like, I think one of the sort of like culture shock things that often Americans experience when you go to Mexico, at least beyond the border, like to Mexico City or somewhere else, is that like most Mexicans don't think about the border that much. It's not like the issue for the people who live in Mexico. And so I think that, probably the presidents flew in for this party and I got briefed and didn't think a whole lot about it. That's my theory.
Well, I would imagine that for Mexicans, they worry probably more about their own southern border and everything that's coming up from Guatemala and places like that. Because, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think migration just hasn't been, it's a relatively new political concern that you'd have people migrating through Mexico. And so I think just historically, it wasn't something that a lot of people talked about, except in the context of, some people going to the U.S.
Yeah. We only have about 15 minutes left, and I can't help but asking, so moving away from the article and sort of your research on salt lakes, tell us a little about that, because, the only salt lake I really know about is, Salt Lake City obviously is around a salt lake. I guess the Dead Sea would qualify around Israel-Palestine. But what are some other salt lakes that have captured your attention that you're doing work on right now? Yeah,
it's funny, like right now I'm in Utah, so when I'm not in Utah, and people are like, what is a salt lake? That's a thing. And here in Utah, people are like, there are others. But actually it's about a third of the world's water, are in salt lakes, at least inland water. Well, it's a third if you don't count the Caspian Sea, and about half if you count the Caspian Sea. So really, they should get, if it's half the world's water, inland water, they should get half the attention, but they don't. But basically, they occur in arid areas where there's a valley that has no outlet to the sea. So they're probably don't get very much attention because they're in very remote places, very desertic areas. So the other, I guess, sort of famous ones that you might have heard of are the Aral Sea in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, which that one has dried up pretty dramatically over the last 40 years largely because of Soviet cotton growing in Uzbekistan. And then also the Salton Sea, which is in California, a few hours east of LA. That's another one that people have often visited. And that's an unusual case because it was created, it was a historic kind of watershed, when the Colorado River, in geological time, when there was more water, it was part of an inland kind of sea connected to the Gulf of California. And also when the Colorado River had more water, it was like an overflow site, but it was temporary, at least in sort of human memory and the indigenous memory that's there. It was always a temporary water body. And now it's existed for about 100 years because they filled in a big flood. They filled it by rerouting the Colorado through an irrigation ditch. So that's one of these lakes that people have sometimes been to or heard about. That's kind of interesting. But the issue that I'm writing about and concerned about is that with sort of increased irrigation needs and climate change, pretty much all of these salt lakes worldwide, almost all of them are really quite threatened and quite in crisis. And it sounds like this completely like provincial and unimportant thing, but actually it's a really big deal for bird life and actually for like local climates. Like, here in Salt Lake City, the lake, they call it the lake effect, and it has a big impact on the city's climate. And you see those impacts repeated around the world. And then sort of, were these lakes to dry up, dust storms would be a really big issue. And actually, the other maybe lake that comes to mind with that is that Mexico City was built on a drained salt lake, or a system of lakes, of which the biggest was saline. And there in the 60s, they had such big dust storms, they had to close the city airport with a lot of frequency. So it's a big threat to a lot of people around the world. And I also think that they're just fascinating, beautiful bodies of water. And so in sort of this same interest in just ecologically, what is the Rio Grande like? I also have this interest in like, these are really cool places and we should appreciate them as such.
Yeah, that we had a weather expert on the podcast a couple of weeks ago, and one of the questions I asked him about whether, because there was a natural gas trader who had talked about how he was worried about conditions in the Western U.S. sort of would resemble the Dust Bowl sort of in the coming decade, and I asked Daryl whether he thought that was true, and I was hoping Daryl was going to say no, like we've been there, done that, and he was like, well, weather-wise, yes, actually, we could get a Dust Bowl type phenomenon, but we've done better with irrigation that would never happen again. And I sort of, Daryl, if you're listening, hi, I sort of stopped at that point and I was like, is that really the case? And it sounds like you're telling me that that's not the case, which is kind of what I suspected.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of playing out right now. I think in the Salton Sea area, gosh, I remember last year I had an article about the Salton Sea that when I was asked to write the social media copy for it, and I included this day in which the air quality, the AQI, the air quality index, was just off the charts in that area. It was 1,600, and anything above 300 is supposed to be hazardous. And the publication posted it, and then one of their editors reached out to me and she was like, I think there's a typo in this. And I was like, no, there's no typo in this. It's that bad. So yeah, dust, but it's also, I think now that I've talked to some more of the dust scientists from around there, they've said it's really hard to disaggregate just it being a desert and a dusty area from the seabed itself. But the thing that is kind of worrisome, both at the Salton Sea and here at the Great Salt Lake, is that there are a lot of hazardous particulates on the seabed that are covered by water. They're sort of safe because they're covered by water, but as soon as they get picked up and are airborne, that's a really big issue. So they're doing really interesting research at the Salton Sea about new kind of asthma pathways, types of asthma that are totally different than what has been observed elsewhere, or what's normally considered asthma, because of the different type of dust. And here at the Great Salt Lake, there's a lot of concern about that too, partially just because there's naturally occurring arsenic in the soil, and partially because there's mining all around the Great Salt Lake that has been dumping, tailings and whatever else into the lake. So presumably a lot of that is settled out on the bottom. Yeah. Jeez.
I don't know a ton about Salt Lake City's history, and you must have been delving into it. So before it was sort of founded, I mean, my loose knowledge of it would be that probably the Mormons got there and made it their capital, and it's sort of been there ever since. What was it like before it became that sort of the capital for the Mormons when they were heading out west? Was there a large community around it, or as you said, are these salt lakes around places that really didn't support large human communities before they were artificially chosen?
Yeah, I mean, one of the really interesting things about Salt Lakes that I have seen in multiple instances, including at the Great Salt Lake, in the archives, is for the indigenous communities, they were kind of a shared resource. And so I think part of the reason that the Mormons end up settling at the Great Salt Lake is because it was a shared resource among the indigenous communities that surrounded the lake. No one was living directly at its shores, so it's sort of like the valley appeared as this kind of like open place that people could settle. That's one aspect of that history, and I do think that there are a few indigenous voices that have been really key to current conservation efforts here at the lake. But I do think that sort of that fact of the settlement happening here right at the lakeshore meant that that connection to the lake got severed in the 1800s. So I think that's something I'm interested in talking with people more about. How are the indigenous tribes kind of able to maintain a connection to the lake when the settlement did sever it a long time ago. And then in terms of the LDS presence here, that's something I wrote about last year in an article and have been looking at in the archives too. That I think people appreciated the Salt Lake Valley because it has all this runoff that ends up its terminal point is the Salt Lake, but really what seemed obvious to love is like the fresh water running in. And so developing kind of like a spiritual connection with the Salt Lake is a little bit more challenging. But I did come across some really interesting settlers' diaries that talk about having a connection to the lake and the ways that they would visit it, like going to the sulfur hot springs and collecting the salt and that kind of thing. So there, people definitely did have a connection to it, but it's when the religious philosophy was so focused on irrigation, I think that's really what kind of like what they saw the role of the water was to be diverted, not to go into the lake.
Is the Great Salt Lake like the Aral Sea in danger of just not being there in a period of years or decades, or are the prospects a little better for it?
It depends on who you ask, and it's like something that's getting played out right now. I mean, literally right now in the Utah legislative session, which is on this month. I think the conservationists have really rallied in the last couple of years. Like even last year, I remember when I wrote that article I just mentioned about the LDS activism around the lake. When I spoke with people, like when I did interviews, they were like, people aren't really engaged in this topic. And then I got here this past month, and it's been a year, and it's a completely different scene. Like there are tons of grassroots organizations. There's tons of involvement. There are people at the Capitol every single day. And so I think that grassroots activism has had an impact. And so the state appointed a Great Salt Lake commissioner who now they've released a report where they've laid out a kind of a pathway to getting to, I believe the lake level they want is, sorry, I should note off the top, I do a general note off the top of my head, but on the air, I'm blanking. They're 2109, what is it? Something like that. 2149. Don't quote me on that. They've appointed this Great Salt Lake commissioner who's laid out a pathway to getting to the lake level that scientists have agreed is a healthy lake level by 2034, I want to say, whichever is the year that Salt Lake City is slated to hold the next Olympics. So it was clear to everyone that this report had a very kind of like political stance, but I think the conservationists, the legislators who are involved in the Great Salt Lake, and the scientists also would all like to see that achieved in less than 20 years. But the government so far has said, okay, we're going to commit to achieving this in 30 years. But I think the thing that gives a lot of people optimism is that saline lakes are more sensitive just because they are this like terminal endpoint of water. Which means that as soon as you divert that water for irrigation, it just doesn't go there anymore. But that also means that it's a simpler problem to solve, because if you just make sure that 1 million acre feet are going into the lake every year by buying water rights or whatever, then that problem is kind of fixed. And so I think that there is sort of just from a practical perspective, there's a reason for optimism.
Yeah, it's not about tearing down a bunch of dams that are supplying power or getting rid of water rights that are growing, tens of millions of dollars worth of produce in agriculture. Caroline, thank you so much for making the time. I know you've got a full schedule today, so we'll say goodbye there. And I hope you'll come back on. This was like really enlightening for me. And I often say at the end of podcasts, like my guests often give me homework. You've given me so much homework that I need to do to learn more about some of this stuff. And I hope you'll come back on once I'm a little bit more dangerous and can probe you on some of these questions a little bit deeper. So thanks so much for taking the time.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I would be thrilled to come back on to talk about water more or anything else. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the Cognitive Dissidence podcast brought to you by Cognitive Investments. If you are interested in learning more about cognitive investments, you can check us out online at cognitive.investments. That's cognitive.investments. You can also write to me directly if you want at jacob@cognitive.investments. Cheers, and we'll see you out there. The views expressed in this commentary are subject to change based on market and other conditions. This podcast may contain certain statements that may be deemed forward-looking statements. Please note that any such statements are not guarantees of any future performance, and actual results or developments may differ materially from those projected. Any projections, market outlooks, or estimates are based upon certain assumptions and should not be construed as indicative of actual events that will occur. Cognitive Investments LLC is a registered investment advisor. Advisory services are only offered to clients or prospective clients where Cognitive and its representatives are properly licensed or exempt from licensure. For additional information, please visit our website at www.cognitive.investments. The information provided is for educational and informational purposes only and does not constitute investment advice, and it should not be relied on as such. It should not be considered a solicitation to buy or an offer to sell a security. It does not take into account any investor's particular investment objectives, strategies, tax status, or investment horizon. You should consult your attorney or tax advisor.